There's a particular kind of moment that passes without any announcement, and you only recognize it later when you look back and realize that something that used to be a matter of conversation had quietly become a matter of fact. I have been thinking about one of those moments lately, not with any sense of alarm, but with the kind of attention I try to give to things that seem small on the surface and turn out to be load-bearing underneath. The moment I keep returning to is not a summit, not a speech, not a headline about some new agreement between nations. It is something far less dramatic and far more consequential, the instant at which a way of moving money between countries stops being a proposal that people argue about and becomes a piece of working infrastructure that people simply use. That transition from idea to plumbing is one of the least glamorous transitions in all of economics, and it is also one of the most irreversible. And I want to sit with that quietly for a while, because I think most people are watching the wrong layer of this entirely. Let me be careful from the very beginning about what I am not saying, because this is a subject that attracts a great deal of noise, and noise is the enemy of clear thinking. I am not saying the dollar is collapsing. I am not saying there is a conspiracy. I am not predicting some sudden day of reckoning where the old order falls and a new one is crowned. I have no interest in the theater of decline, and I have even less interest in the theater of triumph that usually gets sold as its opposite. What I am interested in is structure, the slow accumulation of capability, the quiet laying of rails, the way that systems change not through announcements but through usage. Because the truth is that the world does not turn on rhetoric. It turns on what actually works, on what people actually reach for when they need to get something done. And there is an enormous and underappreciated difference between a thing that is talked about and a thing that is built and used. For most of my life, the conversation about alternatives to the dollar has lived almost entirely in the realm of rhetoric. Nations would gather and issue statements about a multipolar financial world, about reducing dependence, about diversifying reserves, and these statements would be treated correctly at the time as aspiration rather than architecture. It was talk. And talk in the world of money is genuinely cheap because the dollar system was not built out of talk. It was built out of decades of settlement, out of the accumulated habit of the entire planet clearing its transactions through a single set of pipes, out of the deep and almost invisible reliability of knowing that when you needed to move value across a border, there was one road that everyone already knew how to travel. That kind of infrastructure is not defeated by speeches. It is only ever displaced by other infrastructure. And so for a long time, it was entirely rational to dismiss the alternatives because they were words and the dollar was plumbing. What has shifted, and what I think deserves genuine reflection rather than either celebration or fear, not everywhere, not for everything, not at anything close to the scale of the incumbent system, but functionally, in the sense that transactions that used to have no path except through the dollar now have a second path. One that exists, that clears, that settles, that works. And the moment a second path exists and is used even a little, something changes that cannot change back. Because the knowledge of how to use it now exists in the world, and knowledge, once distributed, does not undistribute itself. This is the heart of what I want to explore, this idea of the one-way door. There are changes in the world that are reversible, where you can try something and step back if it does not work, and there are changes that are structurally irreversible, where the very act of crossing rearranges the landscape behind you so that the old position no longer exists to return to. The building of a settlement rail is one of the second kind, and I think this is the single most important thing to understand about the current moment, more important than any particular number or any particular currency. Once a functioning alternative exists and has been used, the question is no longer whether an alternative is possible. That question is answered. The only remaining question is one of degree and pace. And questions of degree and pace are the kind that resolve slowly and then suddenly. Consider what it actually takes to build one of these rails, because the difficulty of building it is precisely what makes it durable once built. You need legal frameworks that multiple sovereign parties agree to honor. You need messaging systems that let banks communicate instructions reliably. You need clearing mechanisms, settlement finality, dispute resolution, and above all, you need trust. Not the warm trust of friendship, but the cold operational trust that the money will actually arrive, that the counterparty will actually deliver, that the system will behave the same way tomorrow as it did today. Building all of that is enormously hard and enormously slow, and that is exactly why it is so significant when it finally exists. The very friction that made it slow to build is the friction that will make it slow to unbuild, and things that are slow to unbuild are, for all practical purposes, permanent features of the terrain. I find that most people underestimate this because they think in terms of the top of the system rather than the bottom of it. They watch the level of pronouncements and reserve percentages and exchange rates, all of which are real, but they are the surface expression of something happening far beneath. The deep layer is the layer of capability, the accumulated, distributed, institutionalized knowledge of how to conduct commerce outside the single road. That capability is a form of specific knowledge held not by an individual, but by an entire network of institutions. And like all specific knowledge, once it is genuinely acquired, it becomes a permanent asset that changes what its holders are able to do. A Treasury official who has now cleared a large transaction through an alternative rail has learned something that cannot be unlearned. A central bank that has now held and used a basket of non-dollar instruments for settlement has developed a muscle it did not have before. These are not reversible events. They are additions to the world's productive capability. And productive capability, once created, tends to be used. There is a body of work that lays out this kind of thinking carefully, the way that durable advantage accrues not to those who make the loudest claims, but to those who quietly accumulate the right forms of leverage, ownership, and specific knowledge, and how those three forces compound over long horizons into positions that are almost impossible to dislodge. It is called the Naval Codex, and it is not a set of predictions or a market commentary. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who ends up building wealth that lasts across decades rather than wealth that evaporates at the first turn of the cycle. My honest suggestion is to sit with the principles themselves rather than any particular application of them, because the principles are what transfer across every situation you will ever face. If it is useful to you, it is linked in the description below, and the code on the screen will take you to it. And with that said, let me return to the mechanics of what happens when a second road opens, because the consequences run deeper than the road itself. The most interesting property of a settlement system, and the property that makes this whole subject worth serious thought, is that it runs on network effects, and network effects are usually described as a source of strength for the incumbent, which they are, but almost no one describes what happens when those same effects begin at the margin to run in the other direction. A network becomes more valuable to each participant as more participants join it, which is why the dollar system has been so extraordinarily stable for so long. Everyone used it because everyone else used it, and that self-reinforcing loop is the strongest moat in economics. But a moat that is filled by everyone's shared choice can also be drained by a shift in that shared choice. And the same mathematics that makes a dominant network almost invincible on the way up makes it quietly vulnerable once a credible alternative crosses a certain threshold of usefulness. This is not collapse. Let me be precise. It is the slow reversal of a gradient. Each participant who gains a second option becomes marginally less dependent on the first, and their reduced dependence makes the second option marginally more viable for the next participant. And so the loop that once ran entirely in one direction begins to have a component running the other way. Margins are where I want to focus, because I think this is where clear thinking separates from lazy thinking. Nobody serious believes the dollar loses its role in some dramatic wholesale fashion. That is not how these things work, and it is not what the structure suggests. What actually happens is a slow erosion at the edges, a percentage of trade here, a share of reserves there, a category of transaction that quietly migrates, a bilateral arrangement that no longer needs the intermediary. And the reason margins matter so much more than they appear to is that the entire value of the dollar system is built on the assumption of near totality. The privilege of the incumbent reserve currency is not linear with its market share. It is deeply nonlinear because so much of the benefit comes from being the default, from being the assumed answer, from being the thing you do not even have to think about. The moment you have to think about it, the moment there is a live alternative that a rational actor might reasonably choose, some of that privilege has already quietly evaporated. Even if the numbers still look overwhelmingly dominant, the map still shows one road, but everyone driving now knows there are two. This is why I keep saying that the significant line is crossed at the level of existence, not at the level of scale. The scale will take years or decades to shift meaningfully, and there may be long periods where it appears that nothing is changing at all, where the dollar's share holds steady and the commentators declare the alternative stillborn. But underneath that apparent stability, the structure has already changed because optionality has been created where there was none. And optionality, once it exists, exerts a constant patient pressure on the incumbent. Because now every action the incumbent takes is evaluated by others against the backdrop of an alternative. The mere existence of an exit changes the behavior of everyone inside the room, even if no one has walked through it yet. That is the deep meaning of irreversibility here, not that the change has happened, but that the option to change has become permanent. I think it is worth pausing on why so few people can hold this idea steadily, because the psychology of it is as important as the economics. Human beings are extraordinarily good at extrapolating stability. We take the world we grew up in, and we assume, at a level far below conscious thought, that its fundamental arrangements are simply how things are, the water we swim in, the background against which everything else happens. The dollar as the world settlement layer has been that background for essentially every adult alive today. It is not something most people evaluate. It is something they assume, the way you assume the ground will be there when you take a step. And assumptions of that depth are the very last things a mind is willing to revise, because revising them is uncomfortable, and because the cost of being early to a revision that never fully arrives feels, in the moment, higher than the cost of being late to one that does. So people cling to the map they were handed, and they mistake the durability of the map's paper for the durability of the territory it describes. There is a comfort in the familiar arrangement that has nothing to do with whether the arrangement is still accurate, and this is where cognitive dissonance does its quiet work. When new information arrives that threatens a deeply held structural assumption, the mind has two options. It can do the hard work of updating the assumption, or it can find reasons to dismiss the new information. And dismissal is almost always the path of least resistance, because it lets everything else in the mental model stay in place. So the intelligent, well-informed observer will often be the most resistant of all, because they have the most sophisticated tools for constructing reasons why the change does not really count, why this alternative is not real, why the numbers do not yet justify attention. Sophistication becomes a mechanism for defending yesterday's map with greater eloquence. I have watched this pattern in every domain I have ever studied, and it is never the uninformed who are most blind to a structural shift. It is the expert whose expertise is an investment in the world as it was. Now, none of this is unprecedented, and I want to be careful not to present it as though it were. Because part of thinking clearly is recognizing that the current moment is an old pattern wearing new clothes. Reserve systems have transitioned before. There was a world in which other arrangements held the central role that the dollar holds now. And those arrangements gave way. And the striking thing about how they gave way is precisely how slow and how quiet it was, right up until the point when it was neither. The transition from one dominant monetary order to another did not happen on a single day, and it was not obvious to those living through the middle of it that it was happening at all. For a long stretch, the old order remained dominant by every visible measure, even as the foundations beneath it were being renegotiated. And the people who positioned early were, for years, simply wrong in the eyes of everyone around them, until the day arrived when they were suddenly and permanently right. Slowly, and then suddenly is not a slogan. It is the actual shape of the curve. And the reason it feels like a paradox is that the slow part and the sudden part are the same process observed at different points along its arc. The historical precedents also teach a subtler lesson, which is that the transition is rarely a clean handoff from one system to a single successor. It is far more often a passage through a period of plurality, a two-system or many-system world, in which no single arrangement holds the totality that the previous one enjoyed, and that intermediate condition can persist for a very long time. This matters enormously for how one thinks about positioning, because it means the intelligent question is almost never which system wins, but rather how do I hold a position that remains sound across whichever mixture of systems actually emerges. The binary framing, old order versus new order, one currency versus another, is precisely the framing that leads people astray. Because reality does not resolve into binaries. It resolves into distributions, into gradients, into coexistence and friction and gradual reweighting. There is a framework that traces exactly this pattern, the way monetary orders actually transition across history, and more usefully, how thoughtful actors have positioned their assets to preserve wealth through the discontinuity rather than being caught defending the arrangement that was passing away. It is called dragon pivot. And I would describe it honestly as neither a forecast nor a prescription to bet on any single outcome. It is an examination of the recurring structure of these transitions and of the principles by which capital has historically been protected when the reserve arrangement itself is in flux. The value in it, to my mind, is in understanding the dynamics of inflation and reserve shifts as a repeating pattern rather than a one-time event, so that you are reasoning from structure rather than from headlines. It is linked below for anyone who wants to go deeper, and it can be reached through the code shown on screen. And having named that, I want to turn to what irreversibility actually does to the way a thoughtful person should think about time. Because I believe this is the part that almost everyone gets backwards. When a change is reversible, you can afford to wait, to watch, to see how it develops, because if you are wrong, the door is still open behind you. But when a change is structurally irreversible, the calculus inverts entirely, and the cost of waiting becomes asymmetric. This does not mean one should act rashly. Quite the opposite. It means one should extend one's time horizon dramatically, because the irreversible change is not a trade to be timed, but a landscape to be lived in. The person who tries to time an irreversible structural shift is making a category error. They're treating a change in the terrain as though it were a fluctuation in the weather. The terrain does not revert. And so the appropriate response to recognizing an irreversible shift is not urgency, but patience of a very particular kind, the patience to reposition for a world that will exist for the rest of your life and beyond, rather than trading around a world that is quietly ceasing to exist. This is where the concept of time horizons becomes genuinely central, because almost every serious error in the handling of wealth comes from a mismatch between the horizon of the decision and the horizon of the change it is meant to address. Structural changes operate on the horizon of decades, and they must be met with decisions made on the horizon of decades. And yet the overwhelming pull of human attention is toward the horizon of days and weeks. The financial world is engineered to capture short horizon attention, to fill every moment with movement and reaction. And this is precisely the wrong frame for perceiving a change whose whole nature is to unfold beneath the level of the daily. To see an irreversible structural shift, you have to deliberately lengthen your gaze to think in terms of where the rails will be in a decade, rather than where the exchange rate is this quarter. And this lengthening of the gaze is itself a form of leverage, because so few people are willing to do it. The advantage does not go to the fastest. It goes to the one whose time horizon matches the true horizon of the change. So what does it actually mean to structure oneself for a two-system world, or more accurately, a multi-system world, without falling into either paralysis or overreaction. I think the answer begins by rejecting the impulse to pick the winner. The person who is certain about which arrangement will prevail is almost always more confident than the evidence permits, and confidence in excess of evidence is the most expensive posture there is. The more durable stance is to hold positions whose value does not depend on the resolution of the question, to own things that remain valuable regardless of which settlement rails carry the transactions, regardless of which currency is quoted at the top of the ledger. And when you ask what those things are, you arrive at something quite old and quite fundamental, which is the distinction between assets that represent genuine productive capability and assets that are merely claims denominated in a particular system. This distinction is the one I would ask anyone to sit with longest, because it cuts through almost all of the confusion. A claim denominated in a particular currency is only as good as that currency's place in the settlement order. It is a bet, whether you intend it as one or not, on the continuation of a particular arrangement. But an asset that represents real productive capability, the ability to produce something people genuinely need, the ownership of a process that generates value, regardless of how that value is ultimately settled, is far more indifferent to which system prevails, because its worth is anchored in the physical and human reality of production rather than in the accounting layer that sits on top. In a world where the accounting layer itself is being renegotiated, the wisdom of anchoring in the layer beneath the accounting becomes obvious. And yet most portfolios are constructed almost entirely at the accounting layer, full of instruments whose value is a pure function of the very arrangement that is in question. I do not mean this as a simple prescription to hold hard assets, because that would be its own kind of naivety. And hard assets held foolishly are no safer than paper held foolishly. I mean something more structural. That ownership of genuine productive capability held with real institutional protection and real understanding of what one actually owns is the position that survives a transition in the settlement order, precisely because its value was never located in that order to begin with. This is the difference between wealth that is engineered out of the financial system and wealth that is grounded in the productive economy. And while financial engineering can compound impressively during the stable phase of a monetary order, it is exposed in a way that grounded ownership is not when the order itself begins to shift. There is a framework devoted entirely to this question of how to build wealth that is durable across generations by grounding it in real productive assets and real institutional protection rather than in financial engineering. And it is called Sovereign Vault. I would be honest and say, it is not a trading strategy and not a scheme for rapid gains. It is a careful treatment of how enduring wealth is actually structured when the goal is to survive discontinuities rather than to optimize for the calm middle of a cycle. What I find valuable in it is the insistence on owning the thing itself rather than a fragile claim upon it, and on pairing that ownership with the kind of protection that keeps it intact across the events one cannot foresee. For anyone whose thinking runs toward the long horizon, it is linked in the description, and the code on the screen will bring you to it. And now I want to close the loop by returning to the psychology, because in the end, the structural analysis is the easy part, and the difficult part is always internal. The hardest thing about a quietly crossed line is not perceiving it, though that is hard enough, but acting on it while the world around you still insists that nothing has changed. There is a genuine social cost to positioning for a world that others do not yet acknowledge, because until the change becomes visible to everyone, the person who repositioned early looks either foolish or alarmist, and human beings are exquisitely sensitive to looking foolish in the eyes of their peers. This is why so many people who correctly perceive a structural shift nonetheless fail to act on it. The perception and the action are governed by different faculties, and the faculty that governs action is far more subject to social pressure than the faculty that governs perception. You can see the line clearly and still stand on the wrong side of it, held in place by the invisible force of everyone around you agreeing that the line is not there. And so the real work, the genuine work, is the internal work of learning to act on structure while the surface still argues otherwise, to hold a position that will only be validated by time, and to be at peace with the long interval between the decision and the vindication. This requires a particular kind of temperament, an equanimity that does not need the constant reassurance of being visibly right, that can tolerate the discomfort of being early, that measures itself against the true horizon of the change rather than against the reactions of the crowd in the short interval. It is, in the deepest sense, a discipline of the mind before it is ever a discipline of capital. And this is why I keep returning to the psychological dimension rather than staying comfortably in the economics, because the economics can be understood in an afternoon and the temperament takes a lifetime. I want to be very careful as I bring this to a close, not to let any of this curdle into a story of one part of the world rising and another falling, because that framing is both wrong and corrosive to clear thought. This is not a story about the superiority of any nation or the inferiority of any other, and it certainly has nothing to do with any essential quality of the people who live under one arrangement or another. It is entirely a story about structure and about stage, about where different systems sit along their trajectories, about the natural life cycle of dominant arrangements, and about the way that no arrangement, however dominant, is exempt from the pressures that eventually reshape all of them. The dollar system was not built on virtue, and it will not be reshaped by vice. It was built on capability and habit and network effects, and it will be reshaped slowly and then suddenly by the emergence of alternative capability and alternative habit and network effects that begin at the margin to run the other way. To moralize about it is to misunderstand it. The line I keep thinking about, then, is not a line that anyone crossed deliberately or triumphantly. It is a line that was crossed the way most genuinely important lines are crossed, quietly, in the ordinary course of institutions doing their work, without fanfare, without a clear date, without anyone in the moment fully naming what had happened. The functioning alternative came into existence not as a declaration, but as a fact. And the world will name that fact years from now, in retrospect, when the consequences have become too large to overlook, and people will speak of it as though it were obvious all along, and they will forget how invisible it was while it was happening. That is simply how structural change works. It is legible only in the rearview mirror, and by the time it is legible, the time to have positioned for it has already passed. What I take from all of this is not any particular action, but a way of holding my attention, a discipline of looking at the layer beneath the layer everyone else is watching, of asking not what is being announced, but what is being built and used, and of extending my horizon to match the true horizon of the changes that actually matter. The changes that actually matter almost never arrive as events. They arrive as slow accumulations that cross a threshold and become irreversible before anyone rings a bell. And the whole art of positioning intelligently is the art of perceiving those accumulations while they are still quiet, and of having the temperament to act on what you perceive before the world has given you permission. The reserve system that has been the background of every economic life now has, for the first time in the lifetimes of most people alive, a genuine second layer running beneath it. And whatever else is uncertain, the existence of that second layer is not. It is here, it is used, and it will not be unbuilt. And so I find myself returning, as I so often do, to a very simple orientation, which is to position for the world that actually exists rather than the world I happen to remember, and to remember that the world I remember was itself once new and unfamiliar and quietly emerging beneath a previous arrangement that everyone assumed was permanent. Nothing in the arrangement of human affairs is permanent except the pattern by which arrangements give way to other arrangements, slowly and then suddenly, and the only durable advantage is to understand that pattern and to hold it with a steady mind. The line has been crossed. The naming will come later, and the quiet, patient work of positioning for what is genuinely there, rather than defending the map of what used to be, belongs to whoever is willing to look one layer deeper and to wait. Let me stay with that idea of looking one layer deeper, because I think there is a subtlety in it that rewards a slower examination, and it has to do with the relationship between visibility and importance. We are trained, almost from birth, to equate the visible with the significant, to assume that the things demanding our attention are the things that matter most. And this instinct served us well enough in a world where the immediate threats were also the largest ones. But in the world of complex systems, and money is among the most complex systems we have ever built, the relationship between visibility and significance is very nearly inverted. The most consequential changes are precisely the ones that do not announce themselves because they operate at the level of infrastructure. And infrastructure, by its very nature, is invisible when it is working. You do not think about the road until it is closed. You do not think about the settlement layer until it fails you. And so the entire architecture upon which the world's commerce rests is, to almost everyone, simply absent from conscious thought. This absence is not ignorance. It is the natural condition of a well-functioning system. And it is also exactly what makes structural change in such a system so difficult to perceive while it is underway. I dwell on this because I think it explains a great deal about why intelligent people, when confronted with the emergence of an alternative settlement architecture, tend to reach immediately for the visible metrics and then declare, on the basis of those metrics, that nothing important is happening. They look at the share of global reserves, at the volume of trade denominated in one currency versus another, at the daily turnover in the great currency markets, and they find, correctly, that the incumbent still dominates by an overwhelming margin, and from this they conclude that the story is overblown. But they are measuring the wrong thing. They are measuring the state of the system rather than the rate of change of its underlying capability. And in a system governed by network effects and non-linear thresholds, the state can remain almost perfectly stable right up until the moment it does not, because the accumulating change is happening at a level the state variables do not capture. It is a little like watching the temperature of water and concluding, at 99 degrees, that nothing dramatic is imminent, when in fact the entire character of the substance is about to change with the addition of a single degree more. The visible metric gives you false confidence precisely because it is smooth, right up until the discontinuity. This is the deep reason that timing these transitions is a fool's errand. And I want to distinguish clearly between two very different mental activities that are often confused: timing a change and positioning for it. Timing is the attempt to identify the precise moment of the discontinuity and to act right before it, capturing the maximum benefit with the minimum exposure to being early. It is seductive, and it is almost always self-defeating, because the discontinuity, by its nature, is unpredictable in its exact timing, even when it is highly predictable in its eventual arrival. Positioning is something else entirely. Positioning is the arrangement of one's affairs so that one is sound across a wide range of possible timings, so that being early costs little and being present at the transition costs nothing, so that the question of exactly when becomes irrelevant to the soundness of the position. The person who positions rather than times has freed himself from the one variable he cannot possibly know, and this is why positioning is a discipline of the patient and timing is a temptation of the anxious. The whole of intelligent behavior in the face of irreversible structural change consists in converting timing problems into positioning problems, in restructuring one's exposure so that one no longer needs to be right about the calendar. There is something almost spiritual in this distinction, and I do not use that word loosely, because what it really asks of a person is the surrender of the desire for control over the uncontrollable in exchange for genuine mastery over the controllable. You cannot control when the reserve order reweights, you cannot control which alternative rails gain traction or how quickly. What you can control is whether your own position depends on any particular resolution of those uncertainties. And the moment you build a position that does not so depend, you have purchased for yourself an extraordinary freedom, the freedom to stop watching the surface with anxiety and to simply live inside a structure that holds regardless. This is the freedom that comes not from prediction, but from the elimination of the need to predict. And I have come to believe that this is the highest form of financial wisdom there is, higher by far than any cleverness about markets. because it addresses the root rather than the symptom. Now I want to return to the network effects running in reverse, because I introduced the idea earlier and I do not think I did it full justice, and it deserves a more careful treatment given how central it is. The standard account of network effects describes a virtuous cycle. More users make the network more valuable, which attracts more users, which makes it more valuable still, and this is why dominant networks are so hard to displace. What is far less commonly understood is that this cycle has a shadow, and the shadow is that the very completeness of the network's dominance is also a form of concentration risk, a single point of dependence that every participant shares. And when a credible alternative appears, the participants do not merely gain an option, they gain the awareness that they had a vulnerability all along. And awareness of a vulnerability changes behavior even when the vulnerability is not currently being exploited. A nation that had never questioned its dependence on a single settlement layer, once it perceives that dependence as a choice rather than a necessity, begins to think about diversification not out of hostility, but out of ordinary prudence, the same prudence that leads any careful actor to avoid a single point of failure. And this prudence, multiplied across many participants, becomes a structural drift away from concentration that has nothing to do with anyone rooting for the incumbent's decline. The subtlety here is that the reversal does not require anyone to prefer the alternative. It only requires that they no longer be able to ignore it. The incumbent's dominance was never truly a matter of everyone actively choosing it. It was a matter of there being nothing else to choose, and passivity did the rest. The moment there is something else to choose, passivity begins to cut the other way, because the maintenance of total dependence now requires an active decision to forego diversification, and active decisions are subject to reconsideration in a way that passive defaults are not. This is why the mere existence of the alternative is so much more consequential than its current scale suggests. It converts the incumbent's position from a default that required no defense into a choice that must be continually justified. And a position that must be continually justified is, in a deep sense, already weaker than one that never had to be, even if the numbers have not yet moved. The moat is still full, but it is no longer being filled automatically. Someone now has to decide, each day, to keep pouring, and eventually someone, somewhere, decides to pour a little of it elsewhere. I think it is important to sit with the fact that all of this can be true, and the incumbent can nonetheless remain dominant for a very long time, because the failure to hold both of these things simultaneously is the source of most bad thinking on the subject. The alternative is real and irreversible, and the incumbent is dominant and will remain so for the foreseeable future. These are not in contradiction. They describe a system in transition. And systems in transition are precisely characterized by the coexistence of the old order's continued dominance and the new order's irreversible establishment. To insist that only one of these can be true is to demand a simplicity that reality does not offer. The mature position holds both, and it draws from holding both a very specific conclusion, that the appropriate response is neither to abandon the incumbent system nor to ignore the alternative, but to structure oneself so as to have a foot in the reality of both, weighted according to one's honest assessment of the trajectory rather than the current state. And this brings me to something I have been circling, which is the question of what it does to a person, psychologically, to live in a period of transition without the comfort of knowing how it resolves. There is a real and often unacknowledged emotional cost to holding uncertainty steadily over long periods, and it is a cost that the human mind is powerfully motivated to avoid, which is why the mind so often resolves the uncertainty prematurely, seizing on either the story of continuity or the story of collapse, simply because a resolved story, even a false one, is more comfortable than an open question. The person who insists the dollar system is eternal and the person who insists it is about to collapse are, at the level of psychology, doing the very same thing. Both are fleeing the discomfort of the genuinely open question into the false comfort of a settled narrative. And I have come to see the capacity to remain in the open question, to hold the transition as a transition without forcing it into a conclusion, as a rare and valuable form of psychological strength. one that is far more useful than any particular conviction about the outcome. This capacity is what allows a person to keep updating as new information arrives, rather than defending a position that is calcified into identity. And I think the calcification of position into identity is one of the great hidden dangers in all of this. Once a person has publicly committed to a view about how the monetary order will evolve, the maintenance of that view becomes entangled with the maintenance of their self-image, and from that point forward, every piece of contrary evidence is experienced not as useful information but as a threat to the self, to be repelled rather than integrated. This is how brilliant people become the last to see what is happening, not despite their brilliance, but because their brilliance has been recruited into the defense of a position that has become part of who they are. The antidote is to hold one's views lightly, as instruments to be discarded when they cease to be useful, rather than as possessions to be defended. And this lightness of holding is itself a discipline, one that runs directly against the grain of how the ego prefers to operate. I want to draw one more dimension of the asset structure question, because I touched on the distinction between productive capability and denominated claims, but there is a further layer beneath it that I think is genuinely important. Even within the category of productive assets, there is a spectrum that runs from the fragile to the durable, and the durability has to do with how deeply the asset's value is rooted in things that persist across systemic change. An asset whose productive value depends on a particular regulatory arrangement, or a particular supply chain that routes through a particular financial system, or a particular set of cross-border relationships that assume the continuation of the current settlement order, is far more fragile than an asset whose productivity is rooted in something more elemental, in the meeting of a genuine and enduring human need, through a capability that would retain its value under a wide range of possible arrangements. The deepest durability comes from owning capability that serves needs that will exist regardless of which system prevails, held in a form that is not itself a hostage to the arrangement in question. This is a more demanding standard than simply owning productive assets, and it is the standard that separates wealth that merely survives the calm from wealth that survives the discontinuity. The pairing of that kind of ownership with genuine institutional protection is the part that I think is most often neglected, because it is unglamorous and it requires foresight rather than cleverness. Owning the right thing is necessary, but it is not sufficient. The right thing, held without protection, can be lost to the very turbulence one was trying to insulate against, whether through legal exposure, through concentration in a single jurisdiction whose arrangements may themselves be in flux, or through the simple failure to structure ownership in a way that survives the events one cannot foresee. The wealth that endures across generations is almost never the wealth that was merely accumulated. It is the wealth that was accumulated and that structured to persist, built with the assumption that the world would change in ways its builders could not anticipate, and protected accordingly. This is the difference between building a fortune and building an institution. And it is the institutions, not the fortunes, that make it across the discontinuities. I keep returning to the word irreversibility because I think it is the true center of gravity of this entire subject, and I want to give it one final examination from a slightly different angle. There is a tendency to think of irreversibility as a threat, as a door slamming shut behind us, and in a certain framing it is. But there is another way to hold it, which is that irreversibility is also what makes intelligent positioning possible at all. If the change were reversible, if the alternative rails might simply vanish tomorrow and the old totality reassert itself, then there would be nothing solid to position for, no stable feature of the landscape to build against, only weather to be endured. It is precisely because the change is irreversible that it becomes a foundation rather than a fluctuation, something one can reason about with confidence, something one can build upon. The irreversibility that seems threatening from the perspective of the defender of the old order is exactly what offers solid ground to the one willing to accept the new reality. The line, once crossed, is not only a loss for the old map, it is a gift of certainty to anyone willing to read the new one. And here is where I find a kind of quiet resolution to the whole meditation. Because the question of how to live in a transitional period finally resolves not into a question of prediction, nor of timing, nor even of clever positioning, but into a question of orientation, of which world one chooses to take as real. Most people, without ever deciding to orient themselves toward the world as they first understood it, the world of their formative years, the arrangement they absorbed before they were old enough to question it, and they carry that map forward and measure everything against it, so that every departure from it registers as an aberration to be explained away rather than a signal to be integrated. And this is entirely natural and almost universal, and it is also the single greatest obstacle to seeing clearly, because the map of the world one remembers is always, by definition, a map of a world that is receding. To orient instead toward the world as it actually is, in its present becoming, requires a continual and slightly effortful act of setting aside the remembered map. And most people simply do not do it, not because they cannot, but because the remembered map is comfortable and the effort is real and the reward is deferred. But for the one who does make that effort, who orients toward what is genuinely there rather than what is remembered, the transitional period is not a source of anxiety at all. It becomes, instead, one of those rare intervals in which the future is unusually legible to anyone willing to look, because the very features that will define the coming order are being laid down now, in plain sight, beneath the surface that everyone else is watching. The rails are being built, the knowledge is being distributed, the capability is being institutionalized. None of it is hidden. It is merely unglamorous, and it is happening at the layer of infrastructure rather than the layer of announcement. And so it is invisible to those who mistake the visible for the significant. To the one who has trained himself to look one layer deeper, the future is not obscure. It is simply quiet. I said at the beginning that there is a particular kind of moment that passes without any announcement and that you only recognize it later. I have come to think that the entire art of living wisely in relation to these great structural shifts consists in learning to recognize such moments earlier, not through prophecy or through cleverness, but through the simple discipline of attending to the layer where the real change happens and holding the resulting picture with a steady and unattached mind. The moment when a parallel settlement architecture stopped being a proposal and became operating infrastructure was exactly such a moment, and it passed, as they all do, without a bell, without a headline that captured its true weight, without the world pausing to mark it. It became a fact while everyone was still debating whether it was possible, and by the time the debate is settled, the fact will be old and the consequences will be well underway, and people will speak of the whole thing as though its arrival had been obvious, forgetting entirely how invisible it was while it was arriving. That is the pattern, and it is older than any particular currency and older than any particular order, and it will outlast the one we are watching shift now, just as it outlasted the ones before. Structural lines are crossed quietly in the ordinary working of institutions and the slow accumulation of capability, and the world only names them years later, when the naming has become unavoidable and also, in a sense, too late to be useful. The whole of the advantage, the whole of the freedom, belongs to whoever is willing to see the line while it is still quiet, to accept its irreversibility as a foundation rather than a threat, and to position, not for the world that is remembered, nor for the world that is loudly proclaimed, but for the world that is genuinely, patiently, and irreversibly coming into being beneath the surface of everything. We are still out of habit watching. Position for the world that exists. The one that is remembered has already gone, and it went, as these things always go, slowly, and then suddenly, and then all at once into the past.